Thank you for attending my talk, Pre-Windows 2000 Backdoors and Bypasses. I'm here to talk about some really old computer accounts in Active Directory, how some of these accounts may be mistakenly set with a guessable password, and to show how attackers can use these accounts to bypass domain policy restrictions, and to kind of share and walk you through how I made some of these discoveries. So a little bit about myself. My name is Garrett Foster. I am a senior consultant on the attack and pen team here at Optiv. I've been here for just about 2 years now. Prior to that, I was working in a security operations center as a security analyst, working for a MSSP. Prior to the SOC work, I worked as a systems administrator for a local MSP here in Portland, Oregon. My primary responsibilities on the attack and pen team are to perform internal and external network penetration tests, and I'm also on the adversarial simulation team where we perform some of our more advanced offerings similar to red teaming. So for this talk, I'll be discussing pre-created computer accounts, specifically those that are configured with pre-Windows 2000 or Windows NT compatibility. I'll be sharing and showing a tool I wrote called Pre2K to automate the identification and discovery of these accounts. And then I'll share a few features that I discovered while down the rabbit hole doing this research. So I feel like I need to begin this talk with a story to justify talking about 30-year-old operating systems. And it starts with a pen test that we were performing last year. So we've been doing work for this particular client for several years now. So the usual suspects had pretty much been locked down. All the quick wins for initial access had been shorn up. So we were struggling. We weren't able to establish that initial foothold. But what we did have was a comprehensive list of their domains. So we had a list of users, computers, groups, and so on. The biggest limitation for this assessment was that we had agreed that any type of password spraying was explicitly out of scope. So we couldn't guess any passwords for their users. But as luck would have it, a consultant over at TrustedSec named Oddvar Mo had posted a really interesting blog about pre-created computer accounts and how, in some cases, they could be used for lateral movement and even domain privilege escalation. So to summarize his blog, the idea is that administrators will often stage or pre-create computer accounts to ensure that when the host is joined to the domain, it is a member of the correct security groups, the right OUs, to ensure that security policies, group policies are applied to the host before it's joined. Makes a lot of sense. So Advar's blog outlined that if the stage computer account is configured as pre-Windows 2000 compatible, which is essentially choosing that radio that you see in the screenshot that's highlighted, they're set with a password that will match the hostname in all lowercase. So we're creating an account called source 0. So the password, once we choose that radio, is going to be the hostname in lowercase, just without the $sign. So he also shared some identifying attributes for these accounts, and the two were the logon count. So I talked before about how these would be created but never used, so that explains that the logon count would never be greater than 0. He also showed that the UAC, the user account control value, is set to 4128, which is the password not required in workstation trust account. However, there's some nuance to these accounts that kind of has to be demonstrated. So if you try to authenticate to SMB, which is essentially the file sharing service on the domain controller, which I'm demonstrating in this screenshot, using those credentials, so we're using the tool called crackmapexec and just using those default credentials that I showed you, and you'll get an actual error when you try to sign in. So the error you get is a status no logon workstation trust account. So in order to use the account, the password has to be reset or changed in some way. However, oddly enough, if you were to try to authenticate to Kerberos, there's no issues. So the second tool that is in that screenshot is impact's gettgt.py Python script. And you'll see that there is no error whatsoever, that if we authenticate to Kerberos, which is what the tool's purpose is, we'll go ahead and grab a Kerberos ticket and we're off to the races. But like I said before, password spraying for this assessment was explicitly out of scope. So we reached out to the client and we consulted and we had a conversation about, well, what we were going to be performing, which is a default credential check, because there's one guess. It either is a good password or it's not, and then that's the end of it. So, when we said we were guessing computer accounts, we kind of got some chuckles, and they thought we were a little bit desperate, which is probably true. But ultimately, they said, yep, they gave us a green light, and we were good to go. So we consolidated our word list, got everything ready, loaded up our favorite password guessing tool, Kerberos, and hoped that we would get at least one account to give us that access so we could kind of press on with the assessment. So imagine our surprise when we run the tool and our whole terminal just lights up green with valid login. At first we thought it was a false positive, so we waited an hour and tried again, and we got the same results. And ultimately, by the end of it, we had over 1,100 accounts, which was totally unexpected, but incredibly interesting. So, I pulled everything down from LDAP I could with each account to kind of, build some patterns and do some research. And the results of that were that most of the accounts matched Aadvaar's criteria and were never used. So you were seeing the bulk of the accounts were set with a UAC value of 4128 and a logon count of 0. However, I was seeing some anomalies and some strange behavior. We had different UAC values, and that can happen. It's not a big deal. But what was really confusing were the logon counts. So anything over 0 would imply that at some point it was in use or even currently in use, which, if you're familiar with how machine accounts in Active Directory work, is that when a machine is joined to the domain, a unique password is set and shared between the machine account and the domain controller, and then the machine itself will reset its password every 30 days and let the domain controller know that the password has been changed. So to see machines with logon counts greater than 0 with a default password was very confusing. So out of curiosity, there's 1,100 hosts, did some DNS resolution and was able to find the 1,100 IPs and performed an Nmap scan. And out of those 1,100, we got 17 back that were alive. All of them were Windows operating systems, and when I tried to authenticate to them, every single one would give me this trust relationship error. So essentially, I couldn't log in because the credentials I had were invalid because the trust relationship was broken. So, with the results of that, I thought that Aadvaar was definitely onto something here, but might only be scratching the surface, and that there might be a chance that this wasn't just an isolated issue to just this one problem. So I figured the best way to start collecting data was to crowdsource it with the rest of the team, and the easiest way to get that sort of help is to make it easy on them doing that favor for me. So I wrote pre-2K. So some of the features that are built in the tool is there's two modules. There's an authenticated approach and an unauthenticated. So the unauthenticated module essentially does what we just walked through. Is it will take a list of machine accounts. It'll format the list correctly, based on the machine and then the password, and it'll do a password guess. And if it's good, if it's valid, it'll return it. If not, it just kind of moves on. But there's also an authenticated approach, so that if you do have valid domain credentials, you could essentially perform the same attack, or you might even call it an audit if you're looking for these accounts. One other feature is threading. So, a domain with 10,000 or so computers isn't necessarily going to take very long, but when you start to get into 100,000, you might want to speed things up a bit. So threading's available if you wanted to go faster. But also at the same time, if you don't necessarily want to go fast, you want to be, I guess we could say evasive as password guessing can be, where you can set a sleep timer and a jitter to where it only guess, a random interval every hour or so, and just kind of plus or minus after that. There's also the targeted search to find the accounts, which is essentially the filters for the attributes that Audvar had already talked about, where that UAC value of 4128 and log on count 0, because that was accurate. That the bulk of the accounts that were found matched that criteria. So I wanted to have that available. The other is that while it was accurate, there were some outliers. So if you want to kind of have a comprehensive look, we can send a full send approach. Every single account, at least do one guess and go on from there. So I shared Pre2K with the team and asked for anyone to at least try the tool. And so if they got any valid accounts, to kind of pull the data down, grab the attributes so I could kind of collect everything and compare and contrast. And the patterns were consistent. We were seeing, varying UAC values. We're seeing log on counts at 0, but also greater than 0. And, I really did expect it to be an uncommon issue. However, for every 10 internals that we were running, we were seeing at least 7 of them had, one valid credential. Most had more, but at least one was 7 out of 10. So for those 2 months, I think the most common foothold we were seeing were SMB null sessions. So essentially, you can authenticate to the domain controller with no credentials and grab a list of users and computers. And then we would take that list of computers, use Pre2K, and find an account, and now we have that initial access. So all this research led to having 2 primary questions that I really wanted the answers to, and that was, the first, why are some accounts behaving as pre-Windows 2000 but are live on the network? That just doesn't track with the understanding of how machines work in Active Directory. The other was, why are these accounts valid for Kerberos authentication without a password change? But every other protocol requires that password reset. So starting with the first, initially my theory here was that there had to be something going on with the passwords when the trust relationship breaks. So maybe there's something with AD that for whatever reason, if the trust relationship breaks, the password gets rolled back to a default value when that trust fails. I've never heard of that before, but it was just a running theory. So trust relationships can fail for several different reasons. Probably the 3 most common are failed replication. And a replication failure in a scenario where that could happen is, say a machine has just reset its password with its logon server, its domain controller. But right after that password reset, it just so happens that the machine reboots. So it goes through the reboot process, comes back online. However, it's now using a different logon server that hasn't received that replication from the domain controller yet. So it's not aware of that password change. So the machine has changed it. The domain is not aware of it. So when it tries to authenticate, that relationship is broken. So any authentication there is going to fail. Another common way is system restore or virtual machine snapshot restores. So say you've got a technician that's troubleshooting an issue, and ultimately their conclusion is, we just want to roll this back to its last known good config. But if that good config is, 30 days prior, the password has changed since then, so it's going to roll back to an old password while the domain is aware of a newer one, and that could cause that trust relationship to fail. And the third, which is probably the most common, at least from my experience, is the clock skew. So there is a security mechanism built into the Kerberos protocol with Microsoft where the authenticating client has to be within a 5-minute window to the authenticating server. So the timestamp has to be in that 5-minute window. If it's outside of that, the clock skew is too great. It's not going to authenticate, and the pre-authentication for the account will fail. So the easiest way to fix that, synchronize the clock with the client, from the client to the server, and then Kerberos should be good to go. But super common, have ran into it all the time. So another way to cause a trust relationship to break is if you just straight up reset the account. So in Active Directory, if you go to the machine, right click reset, you'll break that trust relationship. So when I was working IT, as a tier 1 help desk user, trust relationship issues would happen all the time. And our process was to resolve that issue was to log on to the faulty host with the local administrator credentials, leave the domain, and then from the domain controller, log in there, locate the account's associated domain account, and reset the password. And then once both of those two steps are done, to redo the domain join process, and then everything's good to go. But if you Google what resetting a computer account does, you'll get a ton of results stating that it breaks the trust relationship with the domain. So based on the three issues I've just covered, where dealing with passwords, it's safe to assume that when you reset the computer, something is being done to the password. And this is how I tested my trust relationship theory in a lab. Okay, so kind of demonstrate what I was doing with the trust relationship issues. Okay, so we're going to start from a demo host, and this is just a work group machine, and we're using the local administrator user. To set a baseline, we'll run pre2k from a Kali Linux machine, and we'll see that the source 0 credentials, which were from that previous slide, are default and valid. So we'll run through kind of a proof of concept where we create the test machine and we'll sign it as pre-Windows 2000. So that will be that compatibility that we've already been discussing. But we're also going to take this demo workstation and we're going to go through just the most common way of joining the domain, go into control panel, find the domain through DNS, and then use valid credentials to join that host to the domain. So once that join is successful, we'll reset the computer accounts in our domain controller, and we'll see now that that demo host is a member of the domain. Run pre2k again, and as expected, the test machine, since we've configured it as such, is pre2k. So now we'll reset the account for demo, which is what we're talking about, that breaking that trust relationship, and find that when that is done, that it actually rolls it back to a default password. It sets it as the demo workstation in lowercase, but without the $sign. Next slide. So the conclusion from the trust relationship research, and I tried every method I could discover on how to perform a domain join, and that was from GUI applications, command line tools, you name it. And every time I reset it, it was set to a default password. So any computer account, regardless of how it was created, will have a default password when they're reset. So it'll have that pre-Windows 2000 compatible password when you reset it. And, depending on how you look at it, it could be argued that it's even better that there's no indication to the administrator that this is happening. There's no warning other than that reset, are you sure? So let's look at it a little bit deeper. We talked about Audvar's default, attributes, the UAC value, logon count 0. But if you look at the demo's attributes, the user account value is 4096, which is the most common value when you have a machine. It's the expected one. So it's a workstation trust account. That's it. But also, the logon count is going to be greater than 0 because it has authenticated to the domain. So imagine this has been a member of your domain for 5 years. You go in and reset it. That logon count is going to be excessively higher than 0 and would be missed with the default attributes. So I tried to find any reference I could that's flat out says resetting the computer account would set it to a default password, and I couldn't find anything. The closest thing I could find that basically implies that the password is being reset was this link on Microsoft.com where it says this resets the machine account, and then the highlighted portions, resetting the password for domain controllers using this method is not allowed. So you have to kind of read between the lines that resetting is changing the password. So that's ultimately what's happening. Okay, so why do we care? From an attacker perspective, why do we care? In some environments, gaining access to a machine account can be extremely difficult. Some places will have controls in place that limit who can add machines to the domain, which is great practice. You don't necessarily want your users to be able to just add machines to the domain. So then you're left with a directly compromising the host, which can be pretty risky. And taking over machines is extremely valuable, in my opinion, because to me, they are privilege escalation. As if you took just a vanilla machine account and a vanilla user, the machine account has more privileges in the domain because it can modify some of its own attributes. So I talk about taking what the defense will give you. I make the argument that it's a low risk and high reward. One password guess, and you might have many more credentials. We do like credentials. We like to have that authenticated access. Say, we lose access to one account, we can then pivot back to another one and get right back in. I talk about a trust hop. So essentially there, you'll have multiple domains, and if the trust relationship is configured in a certain manner, a user from domain A can authenticate and enumerate domain B, grab a list of computer accounts, perform kind of the same password guess in domain B, and potentially have that access across the domain and be able to perform the trust hop. I mentioned that the accounts themselves could be privileged. So probably the most common and I guess egregious vulnerability with group memberships is associated with Exchange. So there are hardening features or changes available now, but before, if you were a member of certain Exchange groups, you had a lot of control in the domain and were able to use that access to kind of perform some malicious activity. So if you were to say, reset the computer account for an Exchange server that still has these permissions, you now have a backdoor with privileged access in the environment. And then I also mentioned domain privilege escalation because even in Odvar's blog, he mentions needing a computer account to perform an Active Directory certificate services privilege escalation, and using that account to achieve that objective and ultimately move on with the assessment. So there is a lot of reward for very, very minimal risk. Okay, so 1 out of 2 done. So now we understand that the accounts are behaving as pre-Windows 2000 and are live because the accounts are being reset and they're just lingering and they're not being taken offline. So they look valid, but they technically aren't a member of the domain anymore. So then why the Kerberos authentication? So while I was going through all the different methods to join a machine to the domain or create a computer account, one of the utilities I used was NetDOM. And NetDOM is a tool available on Windows Server operating systems. And when I was reading through the help menu, I noticed 2 very interesting flags available, which were password M and read only. So you'll see on the first line of password M, it says pre-created computer account. And this has been months into the research by now. So anytime I saw that phrase, it was pretty triggering. So essentially, you're going to use the password of the pre-created account and who's just by specifying it and performing the domain join. And it is used with read-only. So the read-only flag performs a domain join using a pre-created computer account and without performing any writes to a domain controller. So there's no changes. So to me, this is very interesting, right? So I gave it a shot. I took that same demo workstation that we were using previously and used the netdom command the way the manual said to do so, and it was successful. So that's kind of I'm calling it a self-service domain join, where you just use the default credentials for the account and you're good to go. So I was curious about it, and all the different methods to try to figure this out, I was running packet captures with Wireshark. So this is a very busy slide, and I apologize, but we'll start from the top where we see the initial name query for the demo host. So it's identifying itself, and a few packets prior to that, it was identifying the domain controller. So the host resolution has been done. The 2 hosts know how to communicate to each other, and it immediately jumps into the Kerberos protocol handshakes. So we see that the pre-authentication was required. You go into that Kerberos pre-authentication, you get the ASREC and rep saying, cool, yep, timestamp's good, everything's good to go. Let's press on and get your ticket. And then the last highlighted section is showing that Kerberos ticket that was requested has been issued, and it's to the CIF service, or essentially SMB, on the DC for the source0.com domain. So once the host resolution had been done, it immediately jumped into the Kerberos negotiation. So to me, observing this, it all looks intentional that this is the way things were supposed to work with the tool. There was no issues, there were no errors whatsoever, so it just jumped straight into it. So I tried to figure out what this tool's purpose was, where it came from, when it was implemented, and the only reference I could find to this behavior was from a 20-year-old Server 2003 book. And for those of you that don't know, Server 2003 came after Windows NT. It was the kind of the transition from Windows NT into Active Directory. So the highlighted portion kind of talks about what's going on, and where if you create the machine and you select that pre-Windows 2000 radio, it allows a computer that's running a legacy operating system to join it to the domain. So you might still have, at the time, had the machines with Windows NT compatibility that you were trying to transition into Active Directory, but you still needed to be able to join them to an Active Directory domain. So to streamline and make it easy on their users, Microsoft added that feature so you could keep going, and it has just lingered since then. Okay, so Kerberos authentication, now we know it was related to kind of the transition from Windows NT into AD, and to be able to let them join the domain. But there was something that kind of stuck out through that whole process. And when you configure the account as pre-Windows 2000, there's an ACE entry is created that restricts the ability to join the computer to the domain to domain admins. That's the default setting. It's not changed. So the demo host itself wasn't a DA. It wasn't even a member of the domain yet. And yet it was still successful in kind of joining the domain, right? So I assumed at this stage that it was possible this ACE just wasn't applying. So an ACE, I should have clarified, is an access control entry. So essentially it's a control list on saying what principals can perform operations. So I'm not a domain admin as a machine, but I was still able to join the domain. So my question was, is can this be prevented? Can you stop it? Can you configure anything in the domain to stop this from happening? So I configured the attribute for it's the MSDS machine account quota, and this is a domain attribute which is originally set to 10, which grants every principal in the domain, users and computers, the ability to perform a domain join up to 10 times. But then I also, I took that one ACE entry on the machine account and expanded it to the entire domain. I wanted to limit only domain admins to join any operating system or any host to the domain through group policy. So another demonstration of kind of that theory, and jump back in. Cool. So we're going to start off at the domain controller. You can see that the machine account quota was set to 0. We got our group policy set to limit only to domain admins. So we'll go ahead and pre-create the demo workstation, create it as pre-Windows 2000 compatible, and jump over to that host. So we're going to see who we are and what domain we're in. We're running a system because we want to be the machine account, and we're in a work group. So if we query for domain users, it will fail because we're not a member of that domain yet. So we'll use a low privilege user account to try to join the domain to test those ACLs, and we'll get an access is denied. So the group policy is applying, machine account quota 0 is applying. So let's try the machine account credentials, because those were valid through the netdom command, but we also get another access is denied. So, okay, the preventions, the security controls are working. So let's join to netdom and see if that will prevent us from being able to perform that join. But that is successful. So even with those ACLs, those restrictions in place, we get that the domain join was successful. And now if we query for domain users, we'll actually get that data back because we're now in a domain context after that domain join was performed. So now the question was, can we detect it? What actually happens during this entire workflow, this process of joining the domain? And the issue is that there's very little that actually happens. So the machine is technically already in the domain, so we're not triggering an event for an account creation. But if you watch through like the default security audit logs, there's only really 4 things that happen. You see a Kerberos negotiation for the account, the netdom authentication. The second is that password reset, because like we talked about before, when the machine joins the domain, that password reset kind of cycles in, and now we change the password, and then 30 days down the road, it will change again. The third is a service principal name change. So there's default service principals for machine accounts, one of them being, CIFS, and then the fully qualified domain name of that machine. So it's just changing those, and the machines themselves have the right to do so. The fourth is a DNS hostname attribute update. So got to have a DNS hostname for it. So once it's joined to the domain, that attribute gets created, and that's the end of it. So arguably extremely benign events that happen multiple times every day. So trying to create intel to detect this would be very, very difficult and noisy. So essentially, my conclusion here is that anyone with knowledge of a pre-Windows 2000 computer account can bypass domain policy restrictions, which we just demonstrated. So if you are aware of the account, you can take any arbitrary server operating system you control and join the domain without issues. So these were reported to Microsoft October of last year. It was acknowledged within a day, and a month later or so, they acknowledged that the password reset, where there's no indication of a default password or anything like that, was granted a moderate severity and closed. They said that the issue would be resolved in a future patch, not necessarily a patch Tuesday, but at some point in the future. And the self-service domain join, which I just demonstrated, was ultimately closed by MSRC and was explained that it is a non-issue. Okay, so that explains all of the Windows accounts and kind of the bizarre ones, but what about all those other accounts? And ultimately, the conclusion there is it's not just Active Directory users and computers. It's not just right-clicking computer account and then choosing that radio. So throughout all that research, I wanted to find every possible way to create a machine in the domain, and I've got a few examples of those for you here. The first being ADCLI, which is a command line tool available on the Ubuntu operating system, and it can be used to actually manage an Active Directory domain, including pre-creating computer accounts. So with the correct flags and the right credentials, you can preset the computer, give it its DNS host name, and everything will be good to go. Another way to create a machine is with the net command. If you're familiar, using net commands are most commonly associated with users looking at the end groups. But there's a net computer command, and that's used for managing them from a domain controller to add and remove them from the domain. So if you create machines with both of these command line tools, and then you use pre2k, you will discover that they are set with default passwords, and it's just the way these tools work. And yeah, so two more examples. I chose to create a machine account with Python to kind of demonstrate how, at a very, very, very high level, how a developer might create a tool or a product that manages Active Directory, but maybe cut corners to kind of streamline things. So you'll notice that on the c.add line that there are attributes, and I'm setting certain values for them. You have the opportunity here to set a password, but it's not required. So you can just omit that, and the machine will still, and the tool will still create the account in the domain. The other is another Windows command line tool called ds-add and a directory services add. And Advar actually highlights this in his blog post, where if you were to use this tool to create a machine in the domain, it will create it, but it will not have a password at all. So with that being said, because there are accounts with no password, there is another flag available in pre2k, which is the TAC-N, so no pass, and it will guess all the machine's accounts in the domain, but without a password, so completely empty. And you'll see that both the Python tool or the Python create a machine and the ds-add create a machine are set with no password. But to really kind of bring the point home of how resetting the computer accounts will configure them with a default password, if you were to go in and create the machines with ds-add and with Python and then right click and reset the account, they will actually set them with a password, but a default one, right? So it'll roll it all the way back and be set to pre-Windows 2000 compatibility. So really, the main takeaway is this seems to be a systemic issue. It's difficult to point the finger at it being one specific problem, and that was originally my theory was it was just through the ADUC GUI. But as I kept going through, I was finding it more and more common that it was, it wasn't just one thing. It was several different things, and there's, it seems to be a systemic problem. I've spoken with several colleagues at other shops, Trusted Sec, Black Hills InfoSec, Fortalis, SecureWorks, and several more, and asked them to run the Pre2K tool if they had the opportunity, and several of them have found accounts. So it's kind of again, I'll use the word systemic. It's everywhere. So, after that whole conversation, how do we make things better? I think that the biggest problem I'm sure we can all agree on is that most companies just don't necessarily have a great idea of what they have or why they have it. So during conversations with some of the clients, we would ask, where did this account come from, or who is in charge, or who manages it. And a lot of the time they had a hard time explaining, or would have to go and dig a little bit. So, I recommend asset management, really understanding what you've got and knowing who's responsible for them. It's a hard undertaking, but it is extremely valuable. Another great strategy, and I've seen this performed with user accounts, is to set a threshold for inactivity. If you have a machine that hasn't authenticated to the domain in, say, 60 days, just set that account to disabled, and then you can work through the issue of reactivating it if that time comes, rather than just leaving the account there and valid and usable, and essentially being a backdoor in the environment. Set it to disabled, and then you lock down that issue. And then I talked about how when I was working in IT that this is just the way we've always done it, and that has seemingly been built into a lot of the tools and products that I mentioned, like the ADCLI, NetDOM, and many others, where there's an extreme amount of tech debt that just because this is the way it's always been done, it's made its way through. So, saying that that's just the way we always do things, that the person that's responsible for that automation or that solution doesn't work here anymore, are pretty common. Those are the excuses that we got several times. So, reviewing processes and procedures and updating those to remove this issue from the environment would be extremely valuable. Okay, so I did want to mention that. So after a lot of the research that I've gone through, Tom Tervoort, I'm sorry if I butchered that name, actually published a very interesting white paper about time roasting, trust roasting, and computer spraying, which is relevant to this conversation, because in that white paper and the tools that he released alongside it, he demonstrates the ability to essentially get a hash for computer accounts through the NTP protocol. So it doesn't disclose the machine's hostname. Everything's associated with a RID, so a numerical value. However, if you're aware, and now that you have the knowledge of default passwords, you could theoretically brute force the 7 or 8 character key space, and if they have set a small host name and its default value, you would get the password back, which is then therefore the host name. So you'd be actually working in reverse of the pre-2K accounts to find a valid password. So definitely check that out. It's fantastic research. Highly recommend that one. But yes, that is the end of that talk. Thank you very, very much for attending. And if there are any questions at all, I will be in the Discord server. And yeah, please don't hesitate. Thanks very much, everyone.